The police lights painted her luxury sedan in strobing flashes of red and blue, turning the quiet, tree-lined street into a spectacle. For Judge Imani Williams, this wasn't just a traffic stop, it was a public humiliation unfolding right in front of her own home. The officer's voice was laced with an unearned confidence, accusing her of driving a stolen vehicle, her vehicle. Every instinct she had, honed by years of commanding a courtroom, screamed at her to remain composed. But he didn't see a respected judge. He saw a target. He had no idea that the woman he was trying to intimidate held the power to dismantle his entire world. He thought he had all the control, but what happens when you accuse the one person who can end your career with a single sentence? Judge Imani Williams had built her life on a foundation of order and reason. Her courtroom was a theater of logic, a place where chaos was tamed by precedent and passion was held in check by the rule of law. Every morning, she donned a black robe that felt like armor, ready to face the raw, unfiltered struggles of the city. But when she came home, she shed that armor at the door. Her house, a beautiful two-story colonial nestled in the manicured enclave of Oakbridge Estates, was her sanctuary. It was a testament to a long, grueling climb from a neighborhood where sirens were the nightly soundtrack to a place where the loudest sound was the whisper of wind through 100-year-old oak trees. This was her peace, earned through decades of relentless work and sacrifice. Her morning ritual was sacred. With a warm mug of coffee in hand, she would stand by the large bay window in her kitchen, watching the sun cast long shadows across the dew-kissed lawns. She saw her neighbors, bankers, surgeons, tech executives, getting into their luxury vehicles, their lives seemingly as pristine as their landscaping. She had chosen Oakbridge not for the status, but for the silence. It was a place where she could finally exhale, a quiet corner of the world where she was just Imani, not Your Honor. Her journey to this quiet street was anything but peaceful. She was raised by a single mother in a cramped apartment on the other side of town, where the justice system felt less like a shield and more like a hammer. She saw good people get crushed by circumstances and bad people thrive in the cracks of a broken system. That experience didn't make her bitter, it forged her. It ignited a fierce, unwavering belief that the law, when wielded with integrity, could be a force for profound good. She worked her way through college and then law school on scholarships and late-night waitressing shifts, fueled by cheap coffee and an unshakable resolve. She remembered the exhaustion, the moments of doubt, the feeling of being an outsider in lecture halls filled with the children of legacy attorneys. But she never wavered. She passed the bar, became a prosecutor, and eventually, through sheer force of will and a brilliant legal mind, was appointed to the bench. She was known for being tough but fair, a judge who listened intently to every story, who understood the human element behind every case file. Her life was a testament to the idea that the system could work, that justice wasn't just an abstract concept but something tangible, something you could build, one verdict at a time. Oakbridge Estates was supposed to be the final piece of that puzzle, the reward for a life lived in service of others. On the surface, it was perfect. The neighborhood had a powerful, though unwritten, code of conduct. Lawns were to be perfectly green, trash cans were to be hidden from view, and disturbances were simply not tolerated. There was a sense of collective pride, a shared understanding that they had all worked hard to be there. Yet, Imani couldn't shake a subtle, persistent feeling of being an observer rather than a participant. Her neighbors were polite, offering crisp, tight-lipped smiles during their morning jogs, but conversations rarely went beyond the weather. She was the only black woman in a senior position of power on her entire block, perhaps in the entire neighborhood. She tried to ignore it, telling herself it was just her prosecutor's mind, always looking for the hidden tension in a room. She was used to being the only one in the room, but here, in her own sanctuary, the feeling was different, more isolating. She wanted to believe the quiet was serene, but sometimes, it felt like a held breath, an unspoken watchfulness that she couldn't quite put her finger on. The first hint of a change came a few months after she moved in. The neighborhood association, in an email peppered with words like proactive and security, announced a new partnership with the local police department called the Community Safety Initiative. It was meant to increase patrols and ensure Oakbridge remained one of the safest communities in the state. Soon, she began to see the same police cruiser making slow, deliberate passes down her street. Behind the wheel was a young officer with a severe haircut and an air of intense self-importance. She learned his name from a post on the neighborhood's private social media page, Officer Miller. Some residents praised his vigilance, his no-nonsense approach. They posted about how he'd question a landscaping crew or stopped a delivery driver to check their credentials. These posts were showered with likes and comments of approval. But Imani saw something else. She saw a pattern. The people being questioned, the ones deemed out of place, always seemed to be people of color. She felt a familiar knot tighten in her stomach. It was the same energy she fought against every day in her courtroom, the insidious creep of bias masquerading as vigilance. She told herself she was overthinking it. This was her home, her place of peace. The world she managed inside her courtroom walls could not possibly be seeping under her front door. The final piece was the car. To celebrate her 5-year anniversary on the bench, Imani had bought herself a gift, a sleek, black, imported luxury sedan. It was the first truly extravagant thing she had ever owned. The car wasn't about showing off, it was a personal monument to her own hard work. It was the culmination of every late night, every skipped vacation, every sacrifice. When it was delivered, it gleamed in her driveway like a polished piece of obsidian. A few days later, one of her neighbors, a man she'd only ever exchanged pleasantries with, paused his lawnmower as she pulled in. He stared at the car for a moment too long, a look of faint surprise on his face. "That's a whole lot of car," he'd said, his tone just friendly enough to be deniable, but his eyes held a flicker of something else, suspicion, or perhaps envy. Imani had simply smiled and nodded, refusing to let his unspoken judgment tarnish her joy. But the interaction stuck with her. It was a tiny crack in the serene facade of Oakbridge, a reminder that no matter how high she climbed, some people would only ever see what they expected to see. The car, her symbol of success, had somehow become a magnet for the very kind of prejudice she had spent her entire life fighting against. And as she would soon find out, that prejudice was about to pull up right behind her, armed with a badge and blinding red and blue lights. The unsettling quiet of Oakbridge Estates began to feel less like peace and more like the calm before a storm. The seed of doubt planted by Officer Miller's presence started to sprout, its thorny vines creeping into the edges of Imani's sanctuary. The first direct encroachment happened on a sun-drenched Saturday afternoon. Imani was on her knees in her front garden, hands deep in the rich soil, a simple pleasure that grounded her more than any legal precedent ever could. It was her escape from the sterile, high-stakes world of the courthouse. Then, a shadow fell over her. She looked up to see Miller's cruiser idling at her curb, the engine a low, menacing hum that seemed to silence the birds. He didn't get out at first, just sat there, his sunglasses reflecting the perfect blue sky, making it impossible for her to read his expression. After a long moment, he stepped out of the car, his movements slow and deliberate, designed to project an unassailable authority. He sauntered over, stopping at the edge of her meticulously manicured lawn. He wasn't responding to a call, he was making one. He started with a practiced, disarming smile that didn't reach his eyes. He claimed he was just making his rounds, getting to know the residents. But his gaze kept drifting from her face to the gleaming black sedan in her driveway. He mentioned a recent string of thefts in adjacent, less affluent neighborhoods, his tone implying a contagion he was determined to keep out of Oakbridge. "High-end vehicles like this," he said, nodding toward her car, "they're prime targets. You'd be surprised who comes trolling through these quiet streets looking for an opportunity." Every word was a carefully chosen barb. He wasn't offering advice, he was delivering a warning, an insinuation that her car, and by extension, she, was an anomaly that attracted trouble. Imani felt a familiar, cold fury begin to smolder in her chest. This was a line of questioning she'd dismantled on the witness stand 1,000 times, the kind of soft profiling that laid the groundwork for injustice. She stood up, brushing the dirt from her hands, her posture shifting from that of a relaxed homeowner to the composed, unshakable presence she was in her courtroom. She met his gaze directly, her voice even and firm, thanking him for his concern but assuring him her security was more than adequate. He pulled out a small notepad. "I'll just get the plate number for our records," he said, the false pleasantry gone, replaced by a flat, official tone. "Just in case." He scribbled it down, but the act felt like an accusation being filed. As he walked back to his car, Imani knew this was not a random visit. It was a test. It was a message. He was telling her, without saying a word, that she was being watched. The illusion of her sanctuary was irrevocably shattered. He drove away, but her peace didn't return. Instead, a grim determination began to take its place. This officer had just made a critical error. He had brought the very fight she presided over every day to her own front door. He had no idea how well she knew the rules of engagement. But what she didn't know was how far he was willing to go to bend them. The next encounter came less than a week later, and it was stripped of all pretense of friendliness. Imani was driving home after a grueling day in court, the city lights shrinking in her rear-view mirror. It was late, the streets of Oakbridge were deserted, and the silence she once cherished now felt heavy with anticipation. As she turned onto her street, a familiar set of headlights appeared behind her, closing the distance with unnerving speed. Then, the night exploded in flashing red and blue. It was Miller. He pulled her over less than 100 yards from her own driveway. The official reason he gave, as he stood at her window shining a blindingly bright flashlight into her eyes, was that she had failed to come to a complete stop at the last intersection. It was a lie. Imani's mind, trained to recall every detail with precision, replayed the last 5 minutes of her drive. She had stopped. She always did. Her adherence to the law was not just professional, it was a core part of her identity. This was not a traffic stop, it was an ambush. "License and registration," he commanded, his voice sharp and impatient. As she retrieved her documents, her hands were steady, but her heart hammered against her ribs. She was Judge Imani Williams, but in this moment, under the glare of his flashlight, she was just another black woman being targeted on a dark road, her credentials and accomplishments rendered invisible. He took her license and registration back to his cruiser, and the wait began. It was a calculated delay, another tool of intimidation designed to make her feel powerless, to let her anxiety fester in the flashing lights that illuminated her for any curious neighbors to see. Minutes stretched into an eternity. She could see his silhouette in his car, not moving, not running her information, just sitting there. He was making her wait. When he finally returned, he handed her back the documents. "I'm going to let you go with a warning this time," he said, as if bestowing a great mercy. Then he leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a low, menacing whisper. "But you need to be more careful. We're watching this neighborhood very closely now. We don't tolerate any trouble here." It was a direct, undisguised threat. It was a promise. As he walked away and his cruiser sped off into the night, Imani didn't move. She sat in her car, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, the adrenaline and anger warring within her. He was escalating. He was building a file, creating a narrative of suspicion around her, one false stop at a time. The helplessness she felt was infuriating, a venomous feeling she hadn't experienced since she was a powerless child watching the world chew up the people she loved. But that helplessness was now crystallizing into something else, something harder and sharper. It was resolve. He thought he was hunting a suspect. He was about to find out he was provoking a judge. And a judge knows that for a case to be won, you must first let your opponent build the case against themselves. The only question now was, what would his final, fatal mistake be? The breaking point arrived on a brilliant Saturday morning, the kind of day that made Oakbridge Estates look like a paradise plucked from a magazine. The sky was a flawless, cloudless blue, and the air was filled with the scent of freshly cut grass and the distant laughter of children. Imani had decided to reclaim a piece of her stolen peace by performing a simple, normal task. She was washing her car. Dressed in old jeans and a t-shirt, with music playing from a small speaker, she worked methodically, the soap and water sluicing away not just the road dust, but some of the tension that had been coiled in her shoulders all week. Her neighbors were out, gardening, walking their dogs, creating a portrait of idyllic suburban life. It was in this moment of fragile normalcy that Officer Miller chose to make his final, public move. His cruiser appeared at the end of the street, but this time, he wasn't driving slowly. He was accelerating. He sped down the block and swerved aggressively, his tires screeching as he used his vehicle to block the end of her driveway. And then he hit the lights. The festive morning atmosphere was instantly shredded by the strobing, urgent pulse of red and blue. The music from her speaker was drowned out by the sudden, piercing shriek of his siren, a deliberate blast to draw every eye on the street. Neighbors stopped what they were doing, their faces a mixture of confusion and alarm. Doors opened. People emerged onto their porches, their weekend tranquility shattered. This was exactly what Miller wanted, an audience. He wasn't alone this time. A younger, nervous-looking officer was in the passenger seat. Miller was putting on a show, using Imani as a training tool for his rookie. He stepped out of his car, his hand resting casually on his holstered weapon, his expression a mask of grim authority. He didn't walk, he stomped across her lawn, his boots crushing the perfectly manicured grass. He stopped a few feet from her, his voice booming across the silent street for all to hear. "Ma'am, I need you to step away from the vehicle," he shouted. Imani stood frozen, the soapy sponge still in her hand. This was it. The culmination of weeks of harassment. "This vehicle," he announced, pointing at her car, "was reported stolen less than an hour ago. We have a positive identification on the plates." The lie was so audacious, so brazen, it almost took her breath away. Her car hadn't left her driveway all morning. This wasn't just harassment anymore, this was a public indictment, a deliberate and malicious act of defamation designed to humiliate her in front of the entire community. He was painting her as a criminal in the one place she was supposed to feel safe. "Put your hands on the hood of the car." "Now," he commanded, his voice cracking with the thrill of dominance. The rookie was now out of the car, his eyes wide, watching his superior officer perform this masterclass in intimidation. Imani could feel the dozens of eyes on her, could feel their judgment and suspicion solidifying with every command Miller barked. All the subtle slights, the cold shoulders, the suspicious glances from her neighbors, Miller was now validating all of it. He was confirming their unspoken belief that she didn't belong here. The frustration, the helplessness, the righteous anger, it all coalesced inside her into a single point of absolute, chilling clarity. She had played by the rules. She had been patient. She had waited for the system to correct itself. But now she saw, with perfect, painful lucidity, that Miller was the system. And he was coming for her. "I said, hands on the hood," he yelled again, taking a step forward and unsnapping the strap on his handcuffs. He saw a woman in jeans, a suspected car thief cornered in a rich neighborhood. He saw an easy arrest. He didn't see the apex predator of the legal world staring back at him. As he reached for her arm, Imani took a slow, deliberate breath. She dropped the sponge, and with a calmness that seemed to terrify him more than any outburst would have, she looked him dead in the eye and reached into the pocket of her jeans. Miller instinctively took a step back, his hand dropping to his sidearm. "Don't move," he screamed. But Imani wasn't reaching for a weapon. She was reaching for the truth. And she was about to bring the full weight of it down on his entire world. The world seemed to shrink to the space between Officer Miller's hand and his sidearm. For a heartbeat, the idyllic Saturday morning held the electric tension of a standoff. His shout of "Don't move" hung in the air, a raw nerve exposed for the entire neighborhood to witness. The rookie officer's eyes were wide with panic, his training offering no solution for a situation that had just spiraled beyond his comprehension. The watching neighbors leaned forward, a silent, captive audience to a drama that had become terrifyingly real. But Imani Williams was not afraid. The fear had been burned out of her by weeks of relentless, targeted harassment. What was left was a core of pure, unadulterated resolve, as cold and hard as a diamond. Her hand emerged slowly from her pocket, not clenched around a weapon, but holding a simple, worn leather wallet. The sight was so mundane, so anticlimactic, that it momentarily confused Miller, breaking his aggressive posture. She didn't flip it open like a prop. She opened it with the quiet, deliberate grace of a monarch presenting a royal decree. She held it out not for him, but for the truth itself to be seen. The sunlight glinted off the golden seal of the state judiciary. Miller took an involuntary step forward, squinting, his mind refusing to process the information his eyes were sending him. The rookie peered over his shoulder, and a small gasp escaped his lips. There, next to a photograph of the calm, determined woman standing before them, were the words that would detonate Officer Miller's world. The Honorable Imani Williams, Superior Court Judge. The transformation in Miller's face was a sight to behold. It was a rapid, violent cascade of emotion. First, blank confusion, as if he were reading a foreign language. Then, a flicker of dawning comprehension, his eyes darting from the ID to her face and back again. This was followed by a wave of nauseating, gut-wrenching horror, the kind a man feels when he realizes he has not just made a mistake, but has willingly sprinted off the edge of a cliff. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a pale, waxy mask of pure terror. He began to tremble, his hand, which moments before had been ready to draw a weapon, now shaking uncontrollably at his side. The rookie stumbled back a full step, as if the ID had physically struck him. In that moment, the power dynamic of the entire situation didn't just shift, it underwent a seismic, violent reversal. The Imani Williams who was a resident, a target, a victim, vanished. In her place stood Judge Williams, and her driveway had just become her courtroom. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was devoid of the anger and frustration she felt. Instead, it was eerily calm, measured, and carried an absolute, crushing weight of authority. It was the voice that silenced belligerent lawyers and brought hardened criminals to a state of terrified attention. "Officer Miller," she began, her tone quiet yet somehow echoing across the unnaturally silent street. "Your badge number is 714. Is that correct?" Miller could only manage a choked, pathetic nod, his throat suddenly too dry to form words. "Good," Judge Williams continued, her eyes locked on his. "Let us review the facts of the case you have so diligently been building against me." She took a step forward, and he flinched. "Fact 1, she stated, her voice as sharp as a scalpel. "On the evening of October 12, at approximately 10:45 p.m., you executed a traffic stop of my vehicle at the intersection of Oak and Elm. The stated cause was a rolling stop. An allegation you and I both know to be false, designed as a pretext for harassment." The rookie looked at his partner, his expression screaming betrayal. Miller's face was now slick with sweat. "Fact 2, she went on, her voice unwavering. "On the morning of October 7, you approached me on my private property without cause. You interrogated me about the ownership of my vehicle and recorded my license plate number under the false pretense of community safety. This action constitutes a clear pattern of intimidation and targeted surveillance." The watching neighbors were no longer just curious, they were transfixed, realizing they were not watching the arrest of a criminal, but the methodical, legal dissection of a corrupt cop. Every word from Imani was a hammer blow, dismantling Miller's authority piece by piece in front of the very audience he had assembled for his triumph. "And fact 3, she said, her voice dropping slightly, becoming even more intense. "Today, October 19, at approximately 11:15 a.m., you blockaded my private property. You activated your lights and siren without cause, creating a public disturbance with the intent to cause alarm. You then, in the presence of your junior officer and in full view of my neighbors, knowingly and maliciously accused me of felony grand theft auto. A charge you fabricated, based on a report that I am certain does not exist." She paused, letting the weight of her accusation settle over the stunned silence. "You did all of this," she concluded, "not to uphold the law, but to humiliate and intimidate a citizen because you judged her to be someone who did not belong in this neighborhood. In that moment, the power dynamic of the entire situation didn't just shift, it underwent a seismic, violent reversal. The Imani Williams who was a resident, a target, a victim, vanished. In her place stood Judge Williams, and her driveway had just become her courtroom. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was devoid of the anger and frustration she felt. Instead, it was eerily calm, measured, and carried an absolute, crushing weight of authority. It was the voice that silenced belligerent lawyers and brought hardened criminals to a state of terrified attention. "Officer Miller," she began, her tone quiet yet somehow echoing across the unnaturally silent street. "Your badge number is 714. Is that correct?" Miller could only manage a choked, pathetic nod, his throat suddenly too dry to form words. "Good," Judge Williams continued, her eyes locked on his. "Let us review the facts of the case you have so diligently been building against me." She took a step forward, and he flinched. "Fact 1, she stated, her voice as sharp as a scalpel. "On the evening of October 12, at approximately 10:45 p.m., you executed a traffic stop of my vehicle at the intersection of Oak and Elm. The stated cause was a rolling stop. An allegation you and I both know to be false, designed as a pretext for harassment." The rookie looked at his partner, his expression screaming betrayal. Miller's face was now slick with sweat. "Fact 2, she went on, her voice unwavering. "On the morning of October 7, you approached me on my private property without cause. You interrogated me about the ownership of my vehicle and recorded my license plate number under the false pretense of community safety. This action constitutes a clear pattern of intimidation and targeted surveillance." The watching neighbors were no longer just curious, they were transfixed, realizing they were not watching the arrest of a criminal, but the methodical, legal dissection of a corrupt cop. Every word from Imani was a hammer blow, dismantling Miller's authority piece by piece in front of the very audience he had assembled for his triumph. "And fact 3, she said, her voice dropping slightly, becoming even more intense. "Today, October 19th, at approximately 11:15 a.m., you blockaded my private property. You activated your lights and siren without cause, creating a public disturbance with the intent to cause alarm. You then, in the presence of your junior officer and in full view of my neighbors, knowingly and maliciously accused me of felony grand theft auto. A charge you fabricated, based on a report that I am certain does not exist." She paused, letting the weight of her accusation settle over the stunned silence. "You did all of this," she concluded, "not to uphold the law, but to humiliate and intimidate a citizen because you judged her to be someone who did not belong in this neighborhood." On Monday morning, Imani did not call the police precinct. She knew that reporting an incident of that magnitude from the bottom up was inefficient. True change, like pressure, is best applied from the top down. She arrived at her chambers an hour earlier than usual and made 2 phone calls. The first was to the personal cell phone of the district attorney, a man with whom she had a long and professional, if not warm, relationship. She didn't recount the story with emotion, she laid out the facts with the same dispassionate precision she would use to instruct a jury. She detailed the pattern of harassment, the false traffic stop, and the final, slanderous accusation, providing dates, times, and badge numbers. She was not a judge demanding a favor, she was a citizen reporting a crime. Her second call was to a senior investigator in the state's Internal Affairs Division, a woman she trusted implicitly. She repeated the facts and made a simple request, to interview the rookie officer who had been present, a young man named Officer Evans. Imani knew the rookie was the key. He was either a conspirator or a victim of his superior's corruption, and his testimony would be decisive. The wheels of justice, which can so often grind agonizingly slow, began to turn with breathtaking speed. By noon, Officer Miller was formally suspended pending a full investigation. By 3 o'clock, Officer Evans was sitting in a sterile interview room, recounting every detail of the incident to 2 stone-faced IA investigators. Terrified of losing a career that had barely begun, he told them everything. He confirmed the traffic stop was a pretext. He admitted Miller had spoken of keeping an eye on the newcomer in the expensive car. And most importantly, his body camera, which Miller had assumed was off, had been recording the entire, disastrous encounter in the driveway. The footage was irrefutable. It captured Miller's swaggering arrogance, his fabricated claims, and the stark, undisguised terror on his face the moment he read Imani's ID. It was a career-ending document, and Miller had filmed it himself. The downfall of Officer Miller was not a quiet affair. Once the local news media caught wind that a sitting judge had been the target of a rogue officer, the story exploded. The police chief, facing a public relations nightmare, held a press conference. He publicly apologized to Judge Williams and the community, announcing a zero-tolerance policy for profiling and abuse of power. The police union, which typically defends its officers with ferocious loyalty, reviewed the evidence, the rookie's testimony and the damning bodycam footage, and took the unprecedented step of publicly refusing to represent Officer Miller. He was completely and utterly alone. Stripped of his badge, his allies, and his credibility, he was fired from the police force in disgrace. But Imani knew that was not enough. A job could be replaced. True justice required accountability under the law. The district attorney's office formally charged Miller with multiple crimes, including filing a false police report, perjury, and official misconduct. Facing the prospect of a jury trial presided over by one of Imani's stern-faced colleagues, Miller crumbled. He accepted a plea deal, pleading guilty to the felony charge of official misconduct. In his sentencing, the presiding judge made an example of him, speaking of the sacred trust that he had not just broken, but intentionally shattered for his own petty, prejudiced reasons. Miller was stripped of his pension, sentenced to 5 years of probation, and was permanently, irrevocably barred from ever serving in law enforcement in any capacity again. His name would now be used at the police academy as a cautionary tale, a lesson in what happens when an officer forgets that the badge is a symbol of public trust, not personal power. The Community Safety Initiative was quietly and permanently dismantled, and the entire precinct was ordered into mandatory and rigorous retraining on constitutional rights and implicit bias, a program personally overseen by the state's top prosecutors. As for the rookie, Officer Evans, Imani made a point of mentioning his full and immediate cooperation to the investigators. He received a formal reprimand and was placed on probationary duty, but he kept his job. He had learned a lesson that day that no amount of academy training could ever teach, that integrity is not about who you are when a judge is watching, but who you are when you think no one is. Imani's single, defiant act had not just ended one man's career, it had triggered a systemic shockwave, forcing an entire department to confront the darkness it had allowed to fester within its ranks. In the months that followed, life in Oakbridge Estates found a new normal. The polite distance from her neighbors was replaced by a palpable, deferential respect. She was no longer just the woman in the colonial house, she was the guardian at the gate. People who once offered tight-lipped smiles now waved warmly. The neighborhood felt safer, not because of increased patrols, but because of the shared knowledge that justice was not an abstract concept, it lived right there on their street. Imani, in turn, found that the violation of her sanctuary had, paradoxically, made it stronger. She had been forced to defend her peace, and in doing so, had solidified her place in the community in a way that quiet conformity never could have. She realized that her true sanctuary was never the four walls of her house. It was the unshakable foundation of her own character and her profound, lifelong belief in the rule of law. The incident had changed her, not by making her bitter, but by deepening her empathy. She returned to her courtroom with a renewed fire, with a first-hand understanding of the powerlessness and humiliation that so many people face when confronted by a system that is supposed to protect them. She looked at the defendants and the victims before her not just as case files, but as people, each deserving of the same dignity and respect she had been forced to demand for herself in her own driveway. The story of what happened on that Saturday morning became a quiet legend in the legal community, a testament to her strength. But for Imani, it was a solemn reminder. Justice had been served, but it had required a judge's ID to light the fuse. It left her with a powerful, lingering question: one that fueled her work every single day: what happens to all the people who are harassed, profiled, and falsely accused, who don't have a title and a golden seal in their wallet to save them? The answer was the reason she went to work every morning. Power, especially power that is abused, seems invincible right up until the moment it is confronted with unwavering truth. And while a badge, a gun, or a title can confer authority, true power resides in the courage to stand your ground and demand the justice that is rightfully yours, not just as a judge, but as a human being.